It was dawn when Evan Carter opened the barn door, and what he saw made his heart skip a beat. In the corner, on a haystack, a thin woman shivered with cold, holding a baby in her arms. A tabby cat peering out from a worn backpack, rain still, dripped down her hair, her eyes filled with fear and exhaustion, but also a silent plea for help. "I just need a safe place for one night," she whispered, never knowing that those words would change everything. What Evan didn't know was that by letting her in, he wasn't just offering shelter. He was opening the door to a dangerous past, secrets that could put them all at risk, and a love that would blossom in the silence. Now the question is, how far could they go before the past came knocking? She appeared at the barn just before sunrise. A thin figure, shivering with cold, with a worn backpack on her back, a baby wrapped in a blanket, and a tabby cat peeking out from under the open zipper. Evan Carter couldn't believe his eyes at first. He had his flashlight in hand, heading to feed the horses when the light met her frightened gaze. "I just need a safe place for one night," she said, her voice weak, almost pleading. That's when everything changed. Before we continue, subscribe to the channel here. It's free, and you'll always receive moving and inspiring stories like this one. And tell me, where in the United States or the world are you watching from right now? Evan, a lonely man since the accident that took his wife in 2004, watched the woman suspiciously. Her eyes were sunken, her hair plastered to her face from the early morning rain, and her arms protected the baby with a strength only desperation can give. She didn't say her name or explain where she came from, but something about the way she held the child, as if it were all she had left, kept Evan from closing the door. He simply nodded toward the driest bale of hay in the corner. "Stay away from the horses and don't touch the tools." That wasn't a yes, but it wasn't a no either. The baby let out a muffled sound, almost a whimper. The cat, who looked more like a guardian of silence, jumped out of the backpack and curled up beside her feet. She took off her wet coat, hung it on the stall railing, and sat, panting, as if the ground had swallowed her fear for a few minutes. Evan stood there, unsure whether to go home or stand there like a lamppost. He took the battery-powered radio from his pocket and turned the knob, but only hissing filled the air. Outside, the engine of his F-100 truck cooled with metallic clicks, and the sound seemed to match the mood of that heavy dawn. The clock on the barn wall read 5:15. Evan huffed, ran a hand over his stubble, and walked to the door. But before he left, he glanced over his shoulder. "There's milk in the fridge. Just don't drink it all." She didn't answer. He just pulled the baby closer and nodded. He left, unsure why he'd left the door ajar, and unlocked it. Morning dawned slowly, with the clouds still thick and the smell of wet earth wafting through the cracks in the barn. Sophie, for that was the name she would later call herself, was still awake. She hadn't slept a single second, but at least she was dry. The baby slept in her arms, and the cat remained alert, as if sensing the slightest sign of danger before it arose. She didn't know how long she could stay, but that barn was already the safest place she'd been in the last 6 months. Evan returned after 7, 2 mugs of coffee in one hand and a thermos under his arm. He set a mug down next to her without saying anything. Then he pulled out a bag of horse feed and began working as if there wasn't a strange woman living in his barn. The silence between them was uncomfortable, but also functional. Sophie realized he was the kind of man who spoke with gestures, not words. And that, in that moment, was a relief. As he changed the straw in the stalls, she took a pacifier from her backpack and cleaned it with a damp cloth before getting it to the baby. She looked at the man with the hat and rolled up sleeves, with his calloused hands and tired eyes, and thought, will he kick me out when the sun really rises? But he just kept working, as if she weren't a problem to be solved. And that, in itself, was more than she'd received from anyone in a long time. Mid-morning, She got up and cleaned the space where she'd spent the night. She took a dry cloth from her backpack and wiped away the mess around it. Evan watched from afar, without commenting. As she was finishing, he approached and said, "There's a bucket of clean water in the corner, if you want to wash your face." She looked at him in surprise, then nodded. She washed her face, dried herself with the old t-shirt she used as a towel, and for the first time, the baby smiled. A toothless, fragile smile, but full of life. Evan saw it and, without meaning to, smiled too. On the porch of the main house, Evan turned on the old tabletop radio and set it to low volume. It played a slow country song, the kind that speaks of longing and broken promises. He looked at the barn with his coffee mug in his hands and asked softly, "What am I doing?" But no answer came. Only the sound of wood creaking in the sun, the wind rustling the leaves, and a cat that, for some reason, wouldn't leave the woman's side. Sophie felt something different that morning. Maybe it was just security, or maybe it was the beginning of something she hadn't named yet, but she was already feeling it. Evan returned to the barn around noon. He carried a bowl of scrambled eggs and 2 pieces of bread with jam. He handed them to her without looking her in the eye. "Here, before it gets cold." Sophie held the bowl in both hands, surprised. "Thank you," she said, her voice breaking. A little. He didn't answer. He just turned away and began stacking bales of hay in the corner. And it was in that silence, between the sound of the horses chewing and the old radio playing in the background, that fate began to weave an invisible thread between them. Sophie finished eating and settled the baby back in her arms. Little. One slept with a serene face, and Simba purred in the corner, keeping watch. Evan stopped stacking the bundles and glanced at her quickly. "You can stay one more night," he said, as if telling the time. "But then we'll see." Sophie clutched the baby to her chest and said simply, "Thank you." And unbeknownst to her, in that moment, she wasn't just gaining shelter. She was entering the place where the past would have to fight against something new, something beginning to be born, even in the silence. The next morning, even before rooster crowed, Sophie was already up, with Noah sleeping tied to her back in a makeshift blanket. Without asking permission, she began sweeping the barn's plank floor with an old broom propped in the corner. Evan, watching from the porch with a mug of coffee in his hand, simply observed. He said nothing, didn't interrupt, but neither did he take his eyes off her. It was as if her presence had clicked into place with a sound unexpected but sure. The silence between them was comfortable, almost complicit. And on that forgotten ranch, nestled between mountains and dirt roads, that was more important than any conversation. Evan only approached when he saw Sophie trying to lift a bucket of water heavier than she was. Without a word, he took it from her hands and carried it easily. "If you want to help, there are a bunch of rusty tools in the shed that need cleaning," he said, his voice low, almost embarrassed. Sophie smiled slightly, surprised by the suggestion. "I know how to use a wire brush," she replied. And that was how, without exchanging full names, without a declared past or future, the two began to function like cogs in the same engine, an old, tired engine. But still pulsing. Simba, the cat who didn't meow, began following Evan wherever he went. He'd sit near his boot, watching as if he were a work inspector. When Evan bent down to hammer a board or fix the fence, the cat would come over and lie down beside him. "Your cat's got his eye on me," Evan commented one day. "He's not mine," Sophie replied with a half-smile. "I think he chose me." Evan didn't answer, but scratched his beard as if he understood perfectly. There, everything that needed to be said was in the eyes, the gestures, and the well-placed silences. Noah, the baby, began to smile frequently. Silly smiles, the kind that show all your gums and make your eyes close. Sophie was moved every time. It was as if each smile were a small healing. And Evan, without admitting it, looked at the boy with a mixture of wonder and tenderness that he himself couldn't explain. One afternoon, while cleaning old harnesses, Evan saw Noah crawling into a shallow puddle of mud and getting all dirty. Sophie ran to pick him up, but before she could say anything, Evan let out a stifled laugh. It was the first time Sophie had heard him laugh. She started making breakfast. Nothing elaborate, just eggs, bread, and a little milk, but made with care. Evan never complained. He ate in silence, occasionally dropping a stray comment like, "Did you season that with rust powder?" Or, "I've had worse at a rodeo." Sophie would respond with a grimace, and he would smile without showing his teeth. And so, in the almost invisible details, they began to weave themselves into each other's routine like filling old holes with new filler, not filling the cracks, but reinforcing what could still hold them together. During the week, Sophie cleaned the porch of the main house uninvited. Evan came in from the barnyard and found her squatting, scrubbing the boards with soap. He didn't interrupt. He simply left a dry cloth beside her and went inside. When he returned, he held out a clean towel and said, "There's a working shower inside if you want it." Sophie hesitated. The ranch was the only place she felt safe, and crossing the threshold of the main house seemed like a huge step. But something in his voice, or perhaps the fact that he didn't insist, made her accept. When he left, toweling his hair dry, Evan pretended not to notice her face lighten. That night, she returned to the barn with Noah sleeping in her arms, and Simba curled up on top of a crate. Evan appeared with a folded blanket and placed it near the haystack. "The nights here get cold quickly," he said. Sophie thanked him with her eyes, because the words simply wouldn't come. She sat down next to the baby, tucked him in, and, before lying down, looked at Evan and asked, "Why did you let me stay?" He paused for a second, thoughtful, and replied, "Because you didn't ask for anything, just peace. And I understand that." Then he turned and walked away, leaving. The porch light on again. That night it rained lightly. The sound of water on the barn roof mingled with the sound of the old radio Evan kept playing in the kitchen, as if an invisible soundtrack lulled the calm growing between them. Sophie watched the sleeping baby, feeling for the first time in a long time that there was something different there, something that wasn't fear or obligation. It was care. And even though neither of them had said it clearly, what was happening on that ranch already had a name. Beginning. Noah woke at dawn, and Sophie led him to the backyard, where Evan was deep in the dirt, planting onions. "He likes to see the sky," she said, holding the baby in her arms. Evan looked at the boy and commented, "Clear skies are a sign of good weather." Sophie smiled. "Is that so?" Evan looked up and for the first time, truly looked at her. Maybe the good weather started when you arrived." Sophie looked down, holding back tears. And Simba, in absolute silence, lay between them, as if sealing the moment without needing to make a sound. There were scars Sophie hid more carefully than any secret. They weren't just on her body. They were in the way she flinched at the sound of hurried footsteps, the way she avoided open windows, the way she hesitated before sitting with her back to a door. Evan, though a man of few words, understood every gesture. He was good with animals because he knew how to listen to silence, and that's what he began to do with her, too. He didn't ask questions, but he noticed everything. He noticed the old bruises on her wrist, the way she placed Noah between herself and anyone, like a shield. One afternoon, while cleaning the old tool shed, Sophie reached for a box, and her sleeve accidentally rode up. Evan saw a bruise that couldn't be explained by a fall. He said nothing. He just looked away and picked up the box for her. Sophie noticed. Her eyes lit up for a second, and she held her breath as if expecting judgment. But he just continued. His work as if he hadn't seen anything. This was what she feared and desired at the same time. To be seen ... without being invaded. That night, Sophie chose to sleep in the barn again. She said it was because of the baby that he calmed himself more there, with the sounds of the horses and the smell of hay. Evan nodded, but that night he left a new pillow next to the bale and added an extra blanket, carefully folded. She also left a bottle of water and 2 oatmeal cookies wrapped in a napkin. When Sophie arrived and saw this, she stood still for a few seconds, staring at the scene as if witnessing a gesture of kindness for the first time in a long time. She sat quietly and cried softly, silently. Simba came over and lay at her feet like a protective seal. Evan didn't sleep early. He stayed in the kitchen, listening to the AM radio, flickering between stations, until he found a slow 80s song, the kind that talks about love we only recognize when we lose it. He watched the light rain fall on the window pane, and without really understanding, felt the house seem less empty. He thought of Sophie. He thought of the baby whose eyes were too alert for her age. He thought of the cat who seemed to understand more than many humans. And without realizing it, he left the porch light on, not out of forgetfulness, but out of hope. Sophie slept like she hadn't in months, lying next to the baby, wrapped in the blanket Evan left, with Simba sleeping on top of a bag of dog food, like a silent guard dog. The noises of the night didn't frighten her. The wind didn't wake her. The nightmares that came like dark waves every morning didn't appear. It was as if the silence of that place had erased the echo of fear. And for the first time, instead of dreaming of screams, slamming doors, and menacing eyes, she dreamed of peace, of the sound of a male voice saying, "You are safe." The next morning, she woke with a start. For a few seconds, she didn't know where she was. But then she smelled hay, saw Simba stretching, and heard Noah's muffled laughter crawling toward Feather. And then she took a deep breath. The light was still on. Evan had left the porch light on all night again. She got up slowly, put on her coat, and carried the baby to the horse pen. Evan was already there, his boots muddy with mud and his warm cap pulled down over his eyes. When he saw her, he simply said, "Did you sleep well?" She nodded with an almost shy smile. "Like I haven't slept since before I ran away." She didn't say who she was running from, and he didn't ask. But in that moment, between the horses snorting and the mist rising from the fields, they knew they were talking about much more than a night's sleep. There was a silent pact there, something stronger than words. It was as if it were saying, "It doesn't matter where you came from, you made it this far. And that's what counts." Sophie looked down at Noah, who was patting his horse, and murmured, "I think this place is magical." Evan shrugged. "Or maybe it's just the one place where no one tells you to shut up." Throughout the day, she began to help more. She washed the dishes, swept the kitchen, organized the tool cabinet. Evan pretended not to notice, but left small signs of acceptance. A chair pulled out, a glass of water left near her, a piece of fruit cut in half. When she took off her shoes to dry and stood barefoot on the porch, Evan noticed her bruised heels, her swollen feet. He went to the cabinet, took out an old ointment, and left it on the doorframe. He didn't say anything, but Sophie understood. And it was then that she realized there were still men who knew how to care, without expecting anything in return. That night, as the baby fell asleep, Sophie sat outside the barn, gazing at the stars. Evan appeared with 2 mugs of hot tea. He sat beside her, but not too close. They sat there for long minutes in silence. And then she spoke, without looking directly at him. "You don't know how much tonight meant." Evan didn't answer right away. He just looked up at the sky and then back at her. Sometimes we don't need to understand the depths of someone else's pain. We just need to leave a light on. Sophie swallowed, her eyes filling with tears. That night, she slept with a blanket. On her body, a baby in her arms, ... and a new hope in her chest. What had been improvised became a habit without either of them realizing it. Sophie started waking up before dawn and had the coffee brewing when Evan appeared in the kitchen, his eyes still puffy from sleep. Sometimes she baked bread in the skillet and filled the house with the smell of goodness, making Noah laugh inside the makeshift stroller she pushed from one side of the kitchen to the other. Evan, without admitting it, started waking earlier just to hear the sound of the baby's laughter and the clinking of spoons on the stove. It was a soundtrack he hadn't heard in years, and one that unintentionally began to fill the empty corners of the house. Outside, the ranch was also changing. The porch gained flowers in repurposed cans. The barn, a new curtain in the small powder room. And inside the shed, Sophie organized everything with improvised labels and clean boxes, as if tidying. Up the chaos around her was her way of taming her inner fear. Evan never asked for any of this, but he didn't complain either. He simply watched in silence. Each small change she made seemed to bring order to the broken pieces he carried. And slowly, without them realizing it, a new landscape began to form one. Where wounds had room to heal peacefully. Noah, now almost 9 months old, crawled around the barn like he owned the place. The horses had grown accustomed to his squeals and banging on the walls. Simba, ever vigilant, never left the baby's side. If Noah went to the pasture, the cat was there. If he slept in the corner of an old mat, Simba lay beside him. Evan joked that the cat was a security guard in disguise. He warns you if anyone strange approaches with a strategic purr, he said one day. Sophie laughed out loud, a laugh that filled the air and made even the kitchen radio sound more lively. One morning, Sophie decided to paint the backyard fence. She grabbed an old can and a battered paintbrush and stood for hours in the sun, with Noah beside her playing in the shade. Evan came over and leaned against the fence, watching. Why do this if no one comes this way? Sophie replied without looking at him. Because I do. That stuck with him all day. That night, he was the one who showed up with another can and a new paintbrush. They sat side by side, painting together. As the sky darkened into shades of orange and pink, they didn't say much, but they didn't need to. Their paint-stained hands spoke louder than any conversation. Days turned into weeks. Sophie began tending the long-abandoned garden. She replanted tomatoes, lettuce, and some herbs. She taught Evan how to make fresh chamomile tea. He showed her how to fix a squeaky hinge. And one of those mornings, she looked at him for a few extra seconds. It wasn't just gratitude. It was something else, deeper, more dangerous. Sophie wasn't used to wishing for good things. She'd always thought happiness was something you paid for dearly later. But there, on that ranch, between the smell of wet earth and Evan's honest eyes, she began to daydream. She dreamed of Noah growing up there, running through the fields, calling out to Evan naturally. She dreamed of cooking dinner in silence, with the radio on low, washing the dishes, listening to his heavy footsteps on the floor. She dreamed of any given Sunday, the three of them on the porch, watching the sunset. And that's when Sophie became frightened, because it wasn't just a pretty dream. It was a wish. And wish, for those who have lived in fear, can be scarier than any scream. Evan, on the other hand, felt the changes too. He started leaving the front door unlocked, making coffee before her, arranging Noah's stroller without being asked. And one night, after washing the dishes, he found a drawing stuck to the fridge with a magnet. It was Noah in a cowboy hat and Sophie, holding hands with a bearded man. It was him. The drawing, simple and childlike, brought a rare smile to his face. "Are we really turning into one of those margarine commercials?" he murmured. But the smile didn't fade. One Saturday afternoon, the portable radio played an old song. Sophie sang softly as she hung clothes on the line. Evan trimmed the garden edges with old scissors. Noah played with a ball, and Simba followed him like a shadow. It was a banal scene, but it was there, in that moment of absolute simplicity, that Evan stopped everything and simply looked at them. His chest tightened, not with pain, but with something new, something forgotten. This felt like home. Not a home of bricks, but one of presence. Of bonds no one planned, but that formed like roots underground. Later, as she placed Noah in the makeshift crib near the window, Sophie sat silently, staring at the baby. Evan appeared in the doorway, leaning against the frame, and asked softly, "Are you happy here?" It took her a moment to answer. Then she said, "I don't know if it's happiness yet, but for the first time, I don't feel like I'm running away." Evan nodded, his eyes locked on hers. And in that moment, neither of them knew if this was the beginning of something, or if they were already well into it. It was a September night when the sky closed in without warning. Heavy clouds swallowed the last trace of dusk, and the wind carried a strange omen. Sophie watched out the window as Evan gathered up the yard tools and secured the well cover with ropes. Noah slept peacefully, and Simba huddled behind the refrigerator as if he already knew this would be an unusual night. The thunderclap, when it came, wasn't just a sound, it was a trigger. Sophie stiffened. Her hands trembled. Her eyes wandered to a past she never wanted to revisit. Evan returned covered in dust and dry leaves. He was knee-deep in mud and wore a tense expression. When he entered, he saw Sophie standing in the middle of the kitchen, like a statue that had forgotten to breathe. "It's okay," he said, but she didn't respond. Another clap of thunder cut through the silence, and she took a step back, her eyes wide, her breath ragged. Evan didn't approach immediately. He stood there, his hands open, waiting for her to see him in the present. "You're here now, Sophie," he said softly. "You're not there anymore. No one will hurt you here." She blinked rapidly, as if coming out of a trance. The tears came unbidden, falling silently. Evan took a step, then another, and when he was close, she pressed her forehead against his chest, powerless to pretend any longer. "He screamed when it rained," she whispered. "He said the whole world obeyed him, that I was only useful when I was silent." Evan swallowed hard. "But you spoke. You left. That already makes you greater than anything he tried to destroy." "You," Sophie cried harder, as if each tear washed away a weight she had carried for years. The storm blew over the ranch. The roof groaned in the wind. The power went out. The house plunged into a damp darkness, broken only by the light of the lamp Evan had lit and placed in the middle of the living room. Noah woke with a start and began to cry. Sophie ran to him and picked him up, trying to calm him, but her hands were still shaking. Evan came in with blankets and lit the fireplace, bringing warmth and a measure of stability to a night that felt like it had been in the past. Simba jumped on the couch, meowing for the first time in days. It seemed to say, "We're together." Sophie sat on the floor, Noah in her lap, still trembling. Evan knelt on her other side and spread a blanket over them both. Then, without saying a word, he sat against the wall, pulling another blanket over himself. He didn't need to sleep there. He could have easily gone to his room, but he stayed, because presence is sometimes the only antidote to fear. And in that room, lit only by dancing flames and shadows on the wall, 3 hearts beat in unison too by necessity. One by choice dot. As the wind howled outside, Sophie began to speak, not like someone telling a story, but like someone purging. A poison. She told of the screams, of the nights she pretended to sleep to avoid confrontation, of the hidden notes, of the days she considered giving up. Evan listened silently, his fists clenched, his jaw rigid. He said no one would believe me if I ran away, that I was crazy, that the baby was his alone. And I believed him for a long time. When her voice broke, Evan slowly approached and placed his hand over hers. You're not alone anymore. Noah was asleep again, oblivious to the emotional turmoil around him. Sophie looked at her son, then at Evan. He doesn't know what fear is yet. And I wanted to keep it that way. Evan's grip tightened on her. And you will, I promise you. She looked deep into his eyes, and for the first time believed him. There was something in his tone, an unshakable certainty that made even the walls tremble less. And amidst the chaos, that cold wooden floor, and a torn blanket were the safest haven she'd ever known. The storm was slow to pass. Thunder came in long intervals, followed by gusts that rattled the windows. But inside, emotions were beginning to calm. Sophie laid Noah down beside her and, without letting go of Evan's hand, rested her head on his shoulder. Thank you for staying, she said. I wouldn't know what to do if I had to spend this night alone. He turned his face slowly and whispered, You won't have to go through anything alone anymore. And in that sentence, spoken almost silently, there was more promise than all the vows she had ever heard. When the sky cleared, leaving only the sound of raindrops running down the gutters, Sophie still slept with her head on Evan's shoulder, Noah between them, and Simba at the foot of the sofa, like a silent sentinel. Evan watched the dawn break through the living room window. The darkness had passed, both outside and inside. He allowed himself to smile, not with complete joy, but with hope. That woman marked by shadows was little by little becoming brighter, and he knew, from that night on, something between them had changed, something irreversible, something true. The ranch was quiet that morning. The clear sky after the storm seemed to reward those who had endured the previous night. Sophie swept the porch, while Noah played with a wooden spoon, tapping rhythmically on the wooden board. Evan was in the corral, changing the salt in the horses' troughs. Everything seemed normal, until the sound of an engine tore through the silence. A black car, gleaming brighter than it should have in that place of dirt and dust, appeared at the top of the gravel road, and before it came to a complete stop, something inside Sophie froze. She dropped the broom. Noah stopped beating. Simba, from where he'd been lying, stood up as if sensing the tension in the air. The car slowed to a stop in front of the fence. A man got out. Dark suit, sunglasses, hair combed with precision. A complete stranger in this rustic world. Evan emerged from the corral, wiping his hands on an old rag. He walked to the gate with slow steps, his gaze hard. "Can I help you?" he asked firmly. The man took off his glasses. "I'm looking for a woman. Name, Sophie Blake. They say she might have been seen around here." Inside the porch, Sophie felt her legs weaken. Her name said aloud, in that tone, in that place, was like a gunshot. She hugged Noah instinctively. Her heart was pounding so hard, it seemed to echo inside the house. The man continued, accompanied by a small child, and curiously, a tabby cat. "We've been told she might be hiding on a rural property, evading legal responsibility." Evan didn't even blink. "I've never heard that name." The man raised an eyebrow. "Are you sure?" Evan rested his hands on the fence, his shoulders relaxed, but his eyes alert. "I do. I know who's stepping on my land." The man was silent for a moment, as if calculating each word. Then he smiled, his teeth bared. If she ever shows up, tell her she can't hide forever. He turned, got into his car, and vanished down the road, kicking up a cloud of dust. Sophie was still motionless, her eyes filled with tears, her arms trembling around Noah. Evan walked slowly onto the porch, closed the door, and locked it. "He's not coming back," he said. But Sophie knew it was a lie. She sat on the couch, still in shock. Noah, innocent, caressed her face as if to erase her fear. Simba jumped onto the back of the couch and stood there, guarding it. Evan knelt in front of her. "You don't need to explain anything, just tell me. What do you want to do?" Sophie took a deep breath. Her eyes met his, as if searching for something stronger than courage. And then, her voice choked but firm, she said, "I want to face it. For the first time, I don't want to run away." That sentence was a turning point, a cut in time, a decision that could never be undone. Evan nodded slowly. "Then we'll face it. Simple as that. No empty promises, no heroics. Just the solidity of someone who won't back down." Sophie held his hand tightly. "You have no idea what he's capable of," she whispered. Evan responded with a firm grip and a dry sentence. "But I know what I am." The sentence wasn't spoken with arrogance, but with the certainty of someone who has defended many important things, and now had found another. The atmosphere between them shifted. The fear was still there, but beside him now was something stronger. Determination. Noah fell asleep early that night, exhausted from the tension he couldn't even fathom. Sophie sat in the kitchen, staring out the window as if the black car might reappear at any moment. Evan appeared with 2 cups of tea and sat across from her. "You told me about what you ran away from, but not what you lost." Sophie lowered her eyes. "I lost the right to trust, the right to sleep with the door unlocked. I lost friends, my job, my identity." He took it all. Evan thought for a few seconds and said, "But he didn't take your strength or your hope. They're still there. I see." Sophie took a deep breath. "I need to get my life back. Not just survive. I want to live without fear. I want to raise Noah without lies, without hiding behind locked doors." Evan rested his elbow on the table, leaned closer. "Then we start now." She looked up. "Even with him around?" "Especially with him around," she replied. "Because now he's not dealing with a woman alone. He's dealing with you and me." And in that instant, Sophie understood that Evan wasn't just shelter. He was foundation. Later, as he closed the windows, Evan passed the room where Sophie and Noah slept. She woke to the light from the hallway. "Are you okay?" he asked softly. "Better than yesterday," he said. She sat up in bed. "Do you still think he might come back?" Evan was silent for a moment. "I think the fear is more persistent than he is." Sophie smiled sadly. "Will you stay with me?" Evan came over, knelt beside the bed, and answered without hesitation, "As long as you let me." Sophie reached out and touched his face. "Then stay. Stay until the end." In the darkness of the room, with Noah sleeping between them and Simba watching from the windowsill, Evan remained there, on his knees, silent. It wasn't the position of a warrior, nor of a lover. It was that of someone who understood the value of staying. And as the stars reappeared in the clear sky, Sophie knew for sure. Fear might even knock on the door again. But this time, she would have someone to fight for. And more importantly, someone who would fight with her. Evan left at dawn without saying where he was going. He just left the coffee ready, a short note on the table, and his clean boots outside the door. Sophie found the note while still holding her teacup and Noah playing with pot lids. "I'll be back before lunch, trust me." And simple, direct, like everything about him. But the note was enough to make her heart race. Because trust ... it was still a painful exercise. Even so, she felt something inside her calm. For the first time, he didn't think about running away. He thought about staying. And he waited. Evan drove for nearly 2 hours to the nearest town, the radio off and his mind elsewhere. He searched for someone who could help them, not just protect Sophie, but give her and the baby what they needed most: a clean name, a legal footing, a real chance to rebuild without fear of losing everything again. He found a firm, discreet, middle-aged lawyer who didn't ask unnecessary questions. If she wants, we can get protective orders and start custody proceedings, but it takes courage. Evan replied calmly, she already has it. She just needs to know that. When he returned, Sophie was hanging clothes on the clothesline, her hair blowing loose in the wind, her t-shirt stained with paint from the day before, and Noah sleeping in a makeshift hammock. She smiled when she saw him get out of the truck, but she could see in his eyes that something had changed. Evan didn't say anything right away. He walked over to her, took a card from his pocket, and handed it to her silently. She can help you, he said. Sophie took the card, read the lawyer's name, and stood still for a moment. You pursued this for me? Evan nodded. For you, but mostly because I saw how you trembled. And no one should have to live like that. Sophie dropped the card, stepped forward, and hugged him. She didn't ask permission. She didn't hesitate. She simply rested her face against his chest and closed her eyes. And Evan, who had for so long avoided any touch that might remind him of the past, allowed himself to sink into that gesture. There was nothing rehearsed, no tension, just a sense of being where he belonged. He wrapped his arms around her, squeezing her tightly, as if to say, you belong here. And in that moment, no words could describe what they both felt, because their bodies had already said it all. The kiss came minutes later, almost by accident. Sophie looked up, and Evan was there. So close the world seemed small. She was about to pull back, perhaps apologize, but Evan cupped her face with his firm hands and kissed her slowly, as if rediscovering something forgotten. It was a calm, unhurried kiss. A kiss that said, I'm here with every second. Sophie responded. In the same rhythm, her eyes closed and her chest open. And when their lips parted, neither of them said anything, because that was enough. It was real. Noah woke to the sound of Simba jumping from his hammock. Sophie pulled away with a shy smile and picked up the baby, her eyes still shining. Evan watched them as if he were seeing the sunset for the first time. There was tenderness in that look, something you only see when you've lost so much and finally start to gain again. Sophie played with Noah's little fingers, trying to hide how shaken she was. But the way she leaned her shoulder against his, even without realizing it, said it all. She was allowing herself to feel. And that, for someone like her, was the bravest step. Later, while Evan was mucking out the stables, Sophie came into the barn with a cup of coffee and a corn cake wrapped in a cloth. She placed it on a bale and stood silently, just watching. He stopped what he was doing and smiled toothlessly, his way. If you keep taking care of me like this, I'll forget what it was like to be alone. Sophie leaned closer, playing, with the cloth in her hands. Maybe that's the point. They laughed together, and laughed lightly, as if they'd known each other for years, as if the pain had finally given way to something new. That night, Sophie made soup. Evan put on music on the radio. Noah clapped his hands, and Simba curled up by the fireplace. And even though neither of them said it out loud, they knew that this was the first night where fear had no place. Evan lit a candle in the center of the table. Sophie thought it was beautiful. Why the candle? She asked. He replied, to remind her there's light in here, always. And Sophie almost cried. But she held on tight, because now she wanted to remember that moment with her eyes wide open. Before bed, Sophie wrote her name on a piece of notebook paper and, for the first time, drew a heart next to it. On the back, she wrote Noah's name ... and Evan's. She folded it, put it in her backpack, and smiled. It was as if she were sealing something she couldn't explain, but which she wanted to protect with all her might. And outside, the ranch breathed in silence, a silence full of life, full of everything that was yet to come. The first brushstroke was timid. Sophie dipped the brush into the can of light blue paint and pressed it against the wood of the back door as if testing the world. The tone was soft, like the sky on mornings when she woke without fear. Noah sat on the floor, covered in flour, holding a small paintbrush Evan had given him to help. Simba, lazy and attentive, watched everything from the kitchen windowsill as if approving every gesture. The house, once silent and smelling of the past, now breathed the present. And for the first time, Sophie didn't feel like a guest. She felt like an owner. Evan approached with a mug of coffee and stood beside her. Blue, huh? Sophie smiled. The color of a clear sky, the color of freedom. He looked at the paint splattered on the floor, on her clothes, and even on her face. It looks like you've really decided to stay. She stopped, looked at him, and replied simply, I've decided to live. That was it. Not just survive, not just exist, to live. And painting that door was like signing this new chapter with color. Courage and hope. Noah, excited, tried to stand up with the brush in his hand and fell flat on his butt. He laughed loudly, smearing paint on his legs. Sophie ran to him, wiping it away slowly as she laughed along. You'll end up painting yourself before the house, she said, kissing his forehead. Evan bent down, helping with a rag. And then it happened. Noah looked at him and said, between laughs, Daddy. The word came out weightless, without hesitation, as if it were the most natural thing in the world. Sophie froze. Evan too. The silence that followed was so filled with emotion that neither of them could disguise its impact. Evan smiled slowly, his eyes moist. He said that before? Sophie shook her head in surprise. Never. Noah laughed again, not understanding the upheaval he'd caused. Evan picked him up, hugging him tightly. If he chose to call me that, then it's because his heart already knows. Sophie bit her lip, overcome with emotion, and said nothing. But in that instant, everything changed. A new bond was born, and it was real, and it was theirs. The following days were filled with little things that made it seem like the ranch had never been lonely. The radio played more often, this time with cheerful songs. Sophie cooked, singing softly. Noah crawled after the ducks in the backyard, and Simba spent the afternoon sleeping in the most absurd places, inside the sock drawer, on top of the laundry basket, even in the sink when he caught a ray of sunlight. Evan laughed at it all, really laughed, like he hadn't since Emily. And that, too, was a silent miracle. Sophie began planting sunflowers near the fence. She said they were flowers that looked toward the light, and that this was a way of teaching Noah something. Evan watched her from afar, like someone watching a scene that only existed in dreams. Sometimes he still woke in the middle of the night, hoping it was all a delusion, too good to last. But then he would hear Sophie breathing in the next room, the baby's gurgling, and Simba's lazy footsteps on the floor. And then he would smile, because it was real. Everything was real. One afternoon, as they were cleaning the porch together, Evan stopped and said, Did you know this house was completely silent for years? No sound, no mess. Sophie, dishcloth draped over her shoulders, looked around. Toys in the corner, clothes hanging, the smell of bread in the air. It breathes now, she replied, and Evan nodded. It breathes because you came, because you filled what I didn't even know was empty. Sophie said nothing. She just rested her head on his shoulder, and she stayed there, feeling that. Finally, she had arrived where she was always meant to be. Noah began taking his first steps onto the lawn. One step, then two, then a stumble with laughter. Evan ran and caught him before he fell. Sophie watched from the porch, her hands stained with paint and dirt, her heart filled with an unprecedented joy. It was like seeing a new world come into being, a world she thought she'd never have, a home that came not with promises, but with actions, that wasn't asked for, but was built day after day, with every gesture, every respected silence, every night with the light on. And one night, while Noah slept and the radio played a soft 90s ballad, Evan walked into the kitchen and found Sophie washing the dishes. The lights dimmed, her hair tied up messily. He stood there, watching, just watching. And then he said, his voice low but heavy with emotion, "You know, I didn't expect anything more from life. I just wanted it to not hurt. But then you came. And now I want everything." Sophie stopped, dried her hands, and looked at him. "Then stay. For everything." Evan leaned in and kissed her slowly, deeper than before. It was love. It was home. The next morning, Evan wrote on a wooden board, "Blue House." He nailed it above the freshly painted door and smiled. Sophie laughed when she saw it. "Name of a new ranch?" Evan replied, "Name of a new beginning." And she understood. The past might have left scars, but the present, right there, in that place, was where the future began to be written. And for the first time, with all her senses, Sophie felt it. It was her life. Finally hers. It was on a quiet Monday that the threat returned, not with footsteps or unfamiliar cars, but with a yellowed envelope discreetly left under the doormat. Evan found it on his way out to feed the horses. He noticed the handwritten name and the carelessly folded paper, like someone unafraid of discovery. He didn't open it. He simply walked in with the envelope in his hand and handed it to Sophie with a tense look in his eyes. She recognized the handwriting as soon as she saw it. Her body froze. Noah played with the pots and pans in the living room, and Simba slept on the back of the sofa. But inside her, a storm was brewing. Sophie walked to the porch and sat in the rocking chair. Evan stood nearby like a sentry. When she opened the letter, her fingers trembled. The words were the same as always. False promises, veiled threats, and that phrase she had read so many times. "If you come back, I forgive you. If not, I will take from you everything that remains." He knew where she stood. That was clear. And more than that, he still believed he could control her with fear. Sophie folded the letter slowly, like closing a door. "He never changes," she whispered. Evan took the letter from her hands and read it silently. His jaw clenched, his eyes hardened, but he didn't explode. He just tucked the letter into his jacket pocket and said, "This won't dictate your life." Sophie stood slowly, her eyes full but steady. I thought I'd buried this past, but it always finds a way to resurface." Evan approached slowly, as he always did when she was breaking inside. "And every time it shows up, you grow stronger. Look where you are. Look what you've built." Sophie stared at him for long seconds. But now he knows, and that changes everything. The afternoon passed like a slow-motion movie. Sophie didn't say much. She paced the house as if each room could disappear. She watched Noah play with the toys Evan had made from recycled wood. She ran her hand over the flowers she'd planted near the fence. She touched the blue paint on the door. It was as if she were saying goodbye without meaning to. Evan, sensing this, didn't press her. But that evening, when she was sitting on the doorstep with Noah asleep in her arms, He sat beside her. "Do you still want to leave?" he asked softly. Sophie took a moment to answer. "I thought," she said, "I thought about packing everything up again, about disappearing, about starting over from scratch for the 100th time." Her eyes filled. "But then I looked at this baby, and he never had roots. He always slept in different places, always woke up afraid of the new. And now he sleeps peacefully. He smiles. He says, 'Daddy.'" She turned to Evan. "And you didn't promise me heaven. You gave me ground." He held out his hand. "So stand firm. I'm here." Sophie took a deep breath. The words came softly, but full of determination. "This time, I won't run. Not for myself, not anymore. But for him, for us. And because if I leave now, he wins." Evan came closer and hugged her tightly. A wordless hug. The kind that holds a body, but sustains a soul. Noah grumbled in his sleep, and Simba purred softly, as if he understood every word. The house was silent, but not empty. It was filled with presence. And that, in itself, was a shield. The next morning, Sophie went to the barn and found Evan already in the corral, messing with the fences. She approached with firm steps and said, "I want to talk to that lawyer." He nodded, unsurprised. "I already left the number on the knitstand." She smiled. "You always know what I need before I ask." He wiped his hands on a cloth and replied, without taking his eyes off her, "Because I pay attention." It was true. He didn't need to barge in, yell, or force. Just being there was enough. And being there, in Evan's case, was enough to protect someone's entire world. Sophie spent the day with Noah on her lap, calling her lawyer, explaining everything, sending documents, activating the protection she hadn't felt she deserved before. When she hung up, Evan watched her from the balcony. Was it hard? She nodded. It was liberating. He made room beside her, and she sat down, exhausted. "I thought I'd be scared," she said, "but what I felt was relief." Evan put his arm around her shoulders. "That's what happens when you stop surviving and start living." Sophie rested her head on his shoulder, closed her eyes, and for the first time since escaping, took a deep breath unhurriedly. That night, as Noah slept again in the middle of the bed between them, Sophie held Evan's hand under the blanket. "Thank you for believing in me even when I didn't." He squeezed back. "You taught me that fear is just a reminder of how much we want to stay. And you want to stay, Sophie. That's enough." She turned her face and kissed him slowly, with the calm of someone who has weathered too many storms. And there, with her eyes closed and her heart at ease, she knew that no matter what the letter said, she was exactly where she was supposed to be. The envelope arrived on a sunny morning, with the court seal stamped in the upper corner, and Sophie's full name, the name she almost forgot to pronounce with pride. She didn't open it right away. She sat at the table, holding the paper as if it held both dynamite and hope. Evan stood by the stove watching, his coffee still warm in his hands. Noah played with toy cars on the living room rug, making noises with his mouth, innocent and peaceful. Simba slept curled up near the fireplace, as always. Sophie finally took a deep breath and opened it. The decision was clear: full and permanent custody of Noah for Sophie Blake. Restraining order granted. Address protected. Authorization for name change. This was more than security. It was freedom signed with an official seal. Sophie let the envelope fall into her lap and closed her eyes. A silent tear fell, then another. Evan knelt in front of her, holding her hands. "You're free," he said, as if each word written with his own relief. Sophie shook her head. "No, we are." And in that moment, her entire life seemed to fit inside a simple piece of paper. That night, Noah slept like he'd never slept before. He was breathing deeply, his arms open, his face relaxed, as if he knew, even without understanding, that the danger had passed. Sophie stood beside the makeshift crib, watching silently. Evan leaned against the doorframe and said softly, "Have you noticed he hasn't been waking up screaming anymore?" Sophie nodded. "It's like he knows he can rest now." Evan approached, placed his hand on her back, and quietly added, "Just like you can too." The next day, she picked up a new can of paint. Blue again, but a deeper, more solid shade. "I'm going to paint the front door now," she said. Evan, his jacket open and his hat askew, leaned against the doorframe and smiled. "You'll end up painting the whole house." Sophie looked at him with a gleam in her eye. Maybe that's exactly what it needs. New coats over the old wood, like us. She wet the brush and made the first pass. The old wood accepted the paint like someone accepting a fresh start. Simba stretched out on the windowsill and for the first time watched without moving. When the door was finished, Sophie descended the porch steps and looked outside at the house. It was different, more alive, as if every detail told a story that, until recently, she thought she'd never have the right to live. Evan approached from behind, put his arm around her waist, and kissed her shoulder. "You look beautiful," he said. She turned slowly and looked him in the eye. "You mean the door?" Evan smiled. "No, all of it. You, us." And then he kissed her, with a smile on his lips, as if to say, "We're here." A calm kiss, full of truth, of love, of home. On the porch, Simba rose from the windowsill and walked to the freshly painted door. He sat down. He looked at them. And then he meowed. A short, hoarse sound, almost unfamiliar, but real. Sophie and Evan looked at each other and laughed. "I think he finally decided to talk," she said. "Or he just wanted to remind us that he's been here all along," Evan added. Simba looked at them both, closed his eyes, and lay down, as if to say, "Mission accomplished." And there, in that simple sound no one expected, was the final sign, the final miracle. The house was home, even for the cat who never meowed. That night, the porch light stayed on, as always, but not out of fear, by choice. Inside the house, Noah slept with a doll Evan had made beside him. Sophie and Evan washed the dishes together, listening to oldies on the portable radio. Simba sat in the rocking chair, keeping silent watch. And when Sophie finished drying the last pot, she turned to Evan and said, "Remember when I only wanted?" One night, he walked over, took the cloth from her hand, and replied, "You've earned it every other night." She rested her head on his chest and sighed. "Now I believe." Outside, the wind blew gently over the fields. The ranch was peaceful. There were no more strangers on the road, no more letters under the rug. There was a growing garden, a painted fence, and a blue door that now stood as a symbol of all that had been rebuilt. Inside, a man who had learned to love again, a woman who had decided to sigh, a baby who had learned what safety meant, and a cat who had finally chosen to talk. And so, amidst paints, hot tea, small steps, and healing silences, Sophie discovered that love doesn't come with shouts or promises, but with gestures, waiting, and embraces that don't ask permission. And in that home, in that shelter, smelling of wood, wet earth, and baking bread, she didn't just live. She belonged. And that ... was more than any happy ending. It was a beginning. And if you've made it this far, tell me, what part of this story touched your heart the most? Was it when Sophie found the courage to stay? When Noah called Evan Daddy without even knowing? Or when even Simba, the silent cat, decided to speak? Up? I'd love to hear your thoughts in the comments, because each look at this story reveals a new detail, might have missed. Subscribe to the channel now and activate the bell to always receive exciting and inspiring stories like this one. Here, you'll find suspenseful romances, soul-warming reunions, and endings that show that true love does exist. Like this video, share it with someone who needs to believe in new beginnings, and tell me where you're watching from. Let's see how far this story can go. And remember, sometimes the home you're looking for can be where you least expect it, even behind a blue door and a cat's meow.